Welcome back, YouTube. Today we're going to talk about fasting, and I'm going to tell you how fasting could be beneficial for you when it comes to weight loss, but what other factors we have to take into consideration when it comes to using fasting, and whether or not it's going to be the best option for you. If someone is doing this, they're massively restricting the amount of time they have in a day to take calories in. And in that scenario, 9 times out of 10, let's say 8 times out of 10, that individual is probably going to find it easier to take in less calories than they were previously, okay, or in comparison to eating throughout the whole day. If you do find this video helpful, please do drop a like. If you have any questions throughout, throw them down below and I'll get back to you. If you haven't already, please do subscribe so you can keep up to date with the rest of the videos. Let's go. Okay, fasting. When it comes to weight loss or fat loss, why fasting is such a big topic and why people have used fasting in the past to help them drop weight loss and fat loss. Okay, now before we get into it, one of the biggest things we have to know and understand and realize is that to drop weight or body fat, we need to be in a calorie deficit. Okay, so a calorie deficit is where you're taking in less food than you are burning. Okay, if you're taking in less food than you are burning or expending, over time, consistently, you are putting yourself in a situation where your body will drop weight and body fat over time. Now, that is so important to understand because fasting can play a big part on potentially helping us put ourselves in a calorie deficit, whether or not we actually even realize that we're doing it. And the reason as to how it can do that is actually quite simple. Okay, before we get into how fasting in itself is going to help us, or potentially help us put ourselves in a calorie deficit, which is vital for fat loss, let's first understand what fasting is, or how people fast, so we can then understand how it's going to help, right? So fasting is basically having a long period of time where you are not eating, okay? So let's say people will maybe fast for like 16 hours, right? And then have a smaller window within that day where they'll eat. Okay, so they might fast for a certain amount of hours, let's say 16, and then eat for maybe like 4 hours, and then repeat. The maths probably didn't work out there in terms of how long they're actually awake, but you get the idea. Okay, so try and make it simple. However, my skills of graph drawing are terrible. So hopefully this doesn't confuse you, but it shouldn't. So here we have a clock / chart to show us and identify how fasting can potentially then help someone put themselves in the calorie deficit, even if they're not aware that they're doing it, right? Let's say someone wakes up at 8 AM and they then fast, so can't eat, until let's say 6 PM, right? They have all this time in the day where they can't eat. There's no caloric intake. And then they have period, let's say, from 6 PM through to 8 or 9 PM where they can eat, okay? This is this window, the clear window where they can eat. So they only have a few hours through the day where they can eat, and where they can take calories in. If someone is doing this, they're massively restricting the amount of time they have in a day to take calories in. And in that scenario, 9 times out of 10, let's say 8 times out of 10, that individual is probably going to find it easier to take in less calories than they were previously. Okay, or in comparison to eating throughout the whole day, right? Now I say 8 times out of 10 because depending on the individual, depending on how they find it, it is still possible, depending on again on what you eat, how you eat. It is still possible within a 4-hour window to still consume a lot of calories. Okay, if you're eating very high calorie dense foods, then all of a sudden in a space of 4 hours, especially if you're very hungry, if you've been fasting for the whole day, it's possible to still take in a lot of calories. And depending on your calorie allowance that you need to be in to drop body fat to remain in a calorie deficit, you still have the potential, even when fasting, to not put yourself in a deficit. However, for most people, let's say, of 8 times out of 10, restricting a window to a very small time period through the day where you can eat is likely going to put you in a calorie deficit. Okay, it's likely going to help for you just to reduce your calories overall. That is how fasting in itself can help people when it comes to weight loss or fat loss, because it can help them put themselves in a calorie deficit whether they're even aware that they're doing it. So, does this mean that everyone should start fasting? Everyone who wants to drop body fat, drop weight should start fasting immediately because it's going to put them in a calorie deficit? Well, no. And that's because even though fasting might be a good way for some people because of that reason to drop body fat, drop weight, doesn't mean it's ideal for everyone, doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone, doesn't mean it's a fail-proof plan, okay? And that's because with everything there's pros and cons. So let's talk about some of the things when it comes to fasting that we potentially have to consider, think about, that then might not work for us as an individual. Okay, number one, we have food management. So very quickly, because I basically just spoke about it, what I mean by this is, even though we only have a small period of time where we can eat, we still have to be very clever about how we're managing that food, because it's still possible for us, even in a small window, to eat enough calories where we're potentially still coming out of a deficit. Again, depending on the individual and their calorie allowance. But simply put, some people, from a day-to-day basis, don't have any calories that they can play around with. Okay, so even a 4-hour window could still be very easy for them to come out of a deficit. So we still have to be managing food very, very well. Secondly, hunger management. Especially if you're very new to trying something like fasting, you might struggle to manage hunger throughout the period of the day where you're not eating. Okay, and if you struggle to manage that hunger, and when it comes to that, then comes to that period where you're then going to eat, if you're starving, very, very hungry, and again, even within that small window, not sure how to manage hunger very well, and again, that leads to then poor food management, all of a sudden, trying to remain within our calorie allowance in that small window can become very difficult. If our hunger management is poor, and again we're starving, we're very, very hungry in a small window, we're going to eat a lot more food. Next we have enjoyment / flexibility. Okay, simply put, some people might not enjoy the fasting approach. Okay, some people might not enjoy having a large window where they can't eat. If you're not going to enjoy something, you're not going to stick to it. Similarly with flexibility, some people might find a fasting approach not very flexible. Okay, again, people might like the option of being able to eat at any point in the day. Okay, and with more restriction and less flexibility, some people might struggle. Okay, because you can only eat in a small window, fasting is then relatively restrictive. Okay, in a certain aspect, so people might struggle with the flexibility side of it. Number 4, training. Something we have to take into consideration, especially when it comes to fat loss in comparison to weight loss, is that we want to retain muscle mass, okay? And training and the stimulus that you then give yourself within training and your muscle is going to be important for retaining muscle mass. So therefore, we don't want our training performance to drop. Now, depending on when you train within your day, within your fasting day, there is a potential, because you might be lower on energy, for your training performance to be hindered, and therefore that stimulus to be hindered. Could that then challenge the retention of muscle? Potentially. However, you could also argue that if you're smart about it, you would try and make sure that your training window is relatively close to your eating window. But again, something to take into consideration, something to think about. In a similar fashion, we have protein intake, okay, which is the last consideration I'm going to talk about. Again, when it comes to fat loss and retaining muscle mass, protein intake and getting adequate protein intake is going to play a role in that. And again, if we've only got a small window throughout the day where we can eat, is that going to hinder our ability to get enough protein in? Probably not, if you're smart about it, okay? So potentially wouldn't be an issue. The only other thing we have to take into consideration is something that we will lack with an approach like fasting, is that we can't have frequent protein feedings throughout the day because we've only got a one small window. That might only be a very, very small concern, especially if you're ticking the boxes of everything else when it comes to retaining muscle mass, and that might not be anything that you really have to worry about, but it's something to, again, take into consideration and to think about. Because whatever approach you choose to use, whether that's fasting or something else, we have to be considering what impact that has on our ability to tick the boxes that we need to tick day in, day out to get the response and the best results that we're after. So there you have it. The main reason as to why fasting can potentially be beneficial for stuff like weight loss and fat loss, depending on the individual, and why you probably see it spoken about a lot, and why you probably heard some people taking or using fat loss as an approach and finding it beneficial for them. However, we've also got to take into consideration the different factors that we need to think about and the potential problems and issues that might come with it. Like with any approach, there's always cons, there's always pros. And we have to take into consideration both those things to decide if it's going to be the best approach for us. Hope you found the video helpful. If you did, please drop a like. If you have any questions after this, throw them down below. I can get back to you in the comments. If you haven't already, please do subscribe so you can keep up to date with these videos. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.